Let me remind you, there are questions that have come in already, but if you have questions, please, if you're on your smartphone, send them to pigeonhole.at. And for those of you watching on the live stream, send your questions, use the hashtag #PoweringProgress. We talked about very alarming statistics, and the people in the room, and I guess this is I'll throw the first question out, right, if it's okay with you guys. Every person here has their own social network, and if they can spread something to their own social network, that would be, there are people from government, people from the private sector, people from civic organizations, there are students in the room, there's media in the room. For each of the panelists, if you were to tell them to do one thing in the next 24 hours that you can actually rally your social network to do, what would that be? And the reason for this is, please take their suggestions very seriously, because last week I just came out of this summit to counter violent extremism. And the best action we can take is not to wait for the climate change summits. It's not just to pressure our governments, it is actually to start it now within our own social networks. And then with social media, that really ripples. So you guys have tremendous power in the room. We're in it together now. You heard alarming statistics. We cannot allow it to get to 4 degrees, and it's not even an academic result. It is our lives on the line. So please, let's start with Tony first, and we'll end with Saya. Please tell us, what can every leader in this room do that could have an impact if rippling through their social networks?
I guess my suggestion would be collaborate. We need to get out of our comfort zones. The work of the future is transdisciplinary. We cannot stay within the business community. We cannot stay within just the social organizations or the scientific community. We need to talk. And in fact, that's the only way that the knowledge that is necessary for resilience will make its way to the future that we all want.
So if you're the head of a company or the head of a school organization, you need to collaborate with other groups to actually come together, as we are today, as Shell has brought us together today. Ambassador Ahmad, please tell us, in your view, what can the leaders here do?
What I really believe in is the power of the individual, because individuals make up organizations, groups, governments, and the like. And I think we need to have a narrative that says, how is climate change affecting me now? And why do I want change? So if you're standing in a queue waiting for a train that never arrives, if your house has been overrun with sewage, if you're swimming in a sea that you would rather not swim in, then complain, because that is when government listens.
And Saya?
Well, aside from heartily endorsing those 2 points, I think that there's something really important about listening. So I think we often talk as leaders about how important it is to spread the message, but something that I think is a little bit poisonous about this resilience space is that resilience itself as a term can become very sort of sustainability. That, I mean, resilience is used to mean a lot of different things. Everybody has their pet definitions of what it means, and if we allow, whether we're working in businesses or working in aid agencies or whatever, our kind of blinders about what we really want resilience to mean for ourselves, to overcome our ability to talk to others about potential solutions in that space, I think it can really inhibit some of the collaborative opportunities that otherwise exist. So listen to what other people are excited about, what kind of resilience understandings they have, and try to incorporate that into the way that you want to kind of deliver value to the world and the society that you work in. Fantastic.
Individual, organizational, and societal going into the countries. So there are many questions. Let me throw the first one coming from Pigeonhole. This is actually to the UK ambassador. You said the UK will commit $100 million to green initiatives, and $7 million has already been spent. Where in Southeast Asia has that money been spent?
Well, let's start with the bigger figure, which is 7.7 billion, which is our commitment to climate fund. Now, we're waiting for the global architecture to come together, but we haven't stood still, because if we waited, then not a single dollar would have been spent up until now. So 2 years ago, when this was announced, we began programs in the Philippines, in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. That was our Southeast Asia impact. And essentially what we're doing at this early stage is going with the flow of what governments want to do. So here, because Pagasa and the DOST and others are working actively on projects. We felt that by programming our money into that, we are actually helping rather than creating brand new initiatives. But there are pockets of funding that have gone to prove concepts. In the island of groups of Camotes, just off of Cebu, DFID, our aid agency, worked with the UN to create resiliency against typhoons before Yolanda. Yolanda tore through this group of islands. The casualty there was 0. That was a small amount of funding. So millions can help, but sometimes hundreds of thousands can help too.
And this is just a follow-up to you because, again, the voice from government. Underdeveloped countries are affected by the emissions from industrialized countries. Shouldn't they contribute more to helping less developed countries cope with the effects of climate change? And always I hear a corollary to that is countries like the Philippines don't actually send out as much as countries like, say, the United States. Is this, the argument?
It's an absolutely fair question. And in some ways it reminds me of the questions I face about British imperial colonial guilt. Yes, it's an undeniable fact that we developed, we polluted, we did things that we would, if with the benefit of hindsight, we wish we hadn't done. But where does it then end? Does it mean to say we are forever paying for our sins? Or does some element of that responsibility fall to the fast developing countries? We're not going to run away from our responsibility. We are committing this 7.7 billion, that in a way is paying for our mistakes. But going ahead, I've got to convince, and our politicians have got to convince, our individual taxpayers to say, well, why should they spend more for others when they need it back at home? And we're winning that argument. We're winning the argument on climate, we're winning the argument on development, where our commitment to contribute 0.7% of our GNI in aid will go ahead and might even become part of our law. But then look at what's happening in other parts of the world. Now the world's biggest international reserve is held by China. They are absolutely vital in recycling capital. ASEAN as an economic bloc is formidable, and therefore, that too needs to come into gear. This is a partnership, not about one side or the other. I think where this climate debate became unhelpful was that the less developed countries or fast developing countries were wanting to hold the whole process for ransom.
Right.
Before they would actually come up with an agreement. That's what I think was the breakthrough in Lima. That's why I think I'm very optimistic that when we get to Paris, we'll actually all land with this idea that, yes, we have a bigger responsibility, but everybody else has to step up and do something too.
Thank you. Saya, this question has 10 votes on it, and it is for you. Any best practices you can share that Centeo has been doing in the issue of resilient cities or communities, lessons learned by Centeo?
Thanks to those 10 people for that question. So our work on resilience is, I would say, concentrated on 2 different types of projects at the moment. One, right now, we've been working very closely with one of our partners, DNVGL, so some of you may know DNVGL is an expert on risk management, on the structural and community piece and how these work together. So how can you as businesses go into communities and see that the investments that you're already making, whether it's through CSR funding or on investments that you're making in building your offices or what have you, how can you ensure that those investments are being made in a manner that actually maximizes the resilience of that community that you're working in, and which then provides benefits back to you. So that's one type of project that we've been supporting. And then another thing which sort of takes one step back in the resilience value chain, which is what we discussed a little bit earlier. We've started to do now more and more a lot of work with companies at sort of the human resources level, working with rising leaders in companies on building their own collaborative practices. How can we all make sure that the next generation of leaders has the kinds of tools and the mindsets that we need in order to be able to work across these sectoral silos that we're also used to experiencing. So that's, I think, another aspect of this, the resilience challenge that we're increasingly interested in targeting. So happy to talk to anybody who has specific questions about either of these initiatives afterwards, or if there's something that you think that this would be interesting for businesses to work on together. That's always really interesting for us.
Fantastic. And a question this is from Twitter that's coming in on the live stream for you, Tony. Flooding as a problem for all of us. What can we do about this?
Oh. Well, as you know, flooding is a complex phenomenon. I think individually, our households, we need to be aware that in fact waterways and drainage ways are clear. And as a collective, as society, we need to be aware that, in fact, the science of climate change is here. We need to be able to be aware of what's going to happen in the future and advocate, as the ambassador says, for a better way of planning our cities.
This question has been voted up 22 times. It's made its way up. And I will throw it to all three of you. It's actually what the panel is about. How do you measure resilience? Seems like you only really find out after the fact. Go ahead, Tony.
Should I start? Well, a current advocacy of the work at the observatory, together with our private sector partners, foundations, as well as corporations, is 3 words. Prepare for the hazards that you know, adapt to our changing environment, and work for transformation. There is no way that things can stay the same. So the 3 words, prepare, adapt, and transform, are part of our urban and our future agenda.
Let me talk about 3 different things that happened, and 2 that have happened and 1 that's likely to happen. When I was head of Southeast Asia and the Pacific region in London, managing our foreign policy, Cyclone Nargis hit Burma, Myanmar. Our projections, given the reluctance of the government to accept international aid in the way we wanted to deliver it and the vulnerabilities of the people, was that that cyclone would have devastating after effects. There would be famine, disease, and all sorts of things that would be long-term. We were absolutely surprised that after the initial wave of aid was delivered, that resilience was almost part of the DNA. People's abject life almost gives them a sense of resilience that many people in urban areas would fail to have. And that, to me, was quite profound. That in a way, it tells me that in many respects, people who are closer to nature probably are better equipped to deal with these calamities than people who live in tower blocks. The second was Yolanda itself, which was a huge calamity. It required assistance, and the country was open to it, and through partnership with the Philippines and the world, we were able to do something quite phenomenal. But the resilience is showing through now, where in the absence of the rehabilitation program really kicking in as fast as it should have done, people are beginning to rebuild their lives. And when the second typhoon hit, some of that came through very early. Government played a role, but so did the people in making sure that they were safe from what was going on. But going forward, one of the things that I've been working on with my colleagues here is a question I asked my own team at the embassy about a month or so after Typhoon Yolanda, which is if the predicted big mega earthquake hit Metro Manila,
Yeah, that's actually
how well equipped are we? And we all looked at each other and we said, do you know, we don't know.
Oh gosh. So this projected big earthquake estimates that 32,000 people will die if the West Valley Fault moves.
Now, from that, we don't know. We are now we've had intelligent conversations with the Philippine government. The British military are sending in an expert group. We've got discussions going on with our own embassy network around the community. We're looking at the landscape of Metro Manila. We're looking at some of the law and order issues that will break out, a more wider scenario than we would otherwise have. Now, in a way, what I'm really saying is resilience also comes from asking those difficult questions.
And Saya.
So I think the way, we get that question a lot actually, I think the way that you measure resilience very much depends on the kind of discipline that you approach resilience from. So if you are, for example, DNVGL, the partner that I mentioned earlier, and you have a background in risk assessment, there are actually tools that are already in place to help you understand what your expected losses are, and you can easily, and this is what they are doing, plug a climate model into these kinds of tools. Imagine, say, the scenarios that your power infrastructure can potentially face from a climate perspective out to 2030, 2090, whatever it is, and then model your expected loss under different adaptation measures. You can make cost abatement curves, and so there are tools like that, but I think they sort of imply an understanding of resilience, which is very much the engineering understanding of resilience. How quickly do you return to the state that you were in previous to an event? How can you minimize the sort of period of loss that you experience in between? And the question asked, is it possible that we're talking about resilience in a way that we can only really observe it after the fact? I think there's something in that, actually. One of the things that I think can be very powerful about resilience is that a challenge that we face in making evidence-based policy and making climate policy is that the timescales on which these different sectors work they're so different. So science, the scientific endeavor works on its own time scale, policymaking works on its own time scale, business works on its own time scale. And it's really hard to solve all these equations simultaneously in a way that generates solutions, right? So resilience in a way doesn't require us to wait for these things to be in place and work in a sort of stepwise fashion. It allows us to be a little bit more proactive and not wait necessarily until we measure exactly what we're trying to manage.
Fantastic. In one of the slides, you talked about how it's the 4 degrees change is catastrophic. And we really, if we don't do anything now, that is where we're headed. What are the main things, I think for the 3 of you from the macro level all the way to the micro level, what are the main things that you see need to happen now to be able to even move it to that 2 degrees? Tony, let's start with you. Always.
I'm deep in thought.
Oh, you're.
I think that, we need to look at the way business is engaging in the practice of what they do and see whether, in fact, there are opportunities to, in fact, reduce those emissions. And Sai and I were talking about this earlier. But also, in fact, adaptation, I think, should be part of an integrated policy. So it needs to be both an integrated adaptation and mitigation framework that we're looking at. At this point, transport, energy, industry, these are the main generators, in fact, of those emissions. How do we bring these activities, in fact, into a more holistic perspective as part of societal development, and then begin to design contextually appropriate interventions for each of the societies?
Saya raised her hand, so the gentleman will be last. Saya, please go ahead.
I wanted to pick up on this because this is a really important point, and as you said, something that we discussed a bit earlier. It's so important that the scale of investment that's required here. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and there's no way that we're going to get to that through these kinds of public funds. We have to leverage private sector finance somehow. We have to figure out ways to make sure that the investments that are already being made can actually be sort of serving many purposes, of which adaptation just naturally becomes one, or resilience naturally becomes one. And in order to really achieve that kind of scale, we have to make sure that resilience moves out of the space psychologically for businesses and other leaders of being the kind of CSR type, nice to have, we'll do this in a community at sort of a pilot scale, into something that's actually part of core business, part of strategy planning, and part of what actually hits businesses where they make decisions.
And Ambassador.
I think the best way to convince people that they're to change is to do things that benefit them immediately.
Yes.
So if you look at the air that we breathe, here in Metro Manila, if you actually simply enforce vehicle emissions, you'd be a long way away from meeting the global target, but actually making individual lives different. If you change the cost of shipping goods within this country because of monopolies and protection that this country has found itself in, the cost of food here would be lower, and you wouldn't have to go all the way to the other side of the world to bring some of the essential food ingredients here. If you wanted to look at the energy mix, you've got the legacy of geothermal, which is fantastic, but the gas opportunity is sitting there, and people turn to coal because it's easy, but gas is actually easier and better, but it needs a conscious policy change. So, and then you look at buildings. Nature here actually tells you how to cool yourself. If you go to the provinces here, most of the houses are built with natural ventilation. You know the direction of prevailing winds, and you do so. I look at the architects of this country and say, do you want to keep on building concrete towers with air conditioning holes?
Okay. Well, let's go back to this country. A question. Seeing as the Philippines is ranked number 2 in the risk list, somebody else on Twitter actually said they went and looked for the study and wanted to know more details about that. But given that, you may not know, Asif, but perhaps what is the government planning in order to mitigate the risks of climate change? Let me throw it to Tony.
I think maybe just a quick clarification on that World Risk Index study, the report. The Philippines was historically number 3 behind Tonga and Vanuatu, as you know, and has risen to number 2 in terms of risk because of urbanization. really urbanization patterns. And in fact, with the focus on particularly the rise of and continued increase of informality. What the government is doing, I think, is really commendable at this point. I mean, there is a climate change commission that in fact sets out the climate adaptation agenda and looks at emissions reductions as part of their policy framework as well. So there is a national adaptation plan for the country. We should mention that, in fact, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council has an expanded agenda to look at not just natural disasters, but of course, looking at risk overall and looking at vulnerability and exposure as part of their scope of work. Now, PAGASA, as the ambassador has said, which is the National Weather Agency, has seen continuous upgrades. In fact, not just in equipment, material, but also in people. And these investments are really slated to have a long-term positive value on our climate change adaptation plans.
Are we moving fast enough in the short term? I mean, we have an average of 20 typhoons every year. Are we moving fast enough?
I think that the matter of fast enough and the number of typhoons would be a question to think about, because in fact, the number of typhoons has not increased. It's the kind of tropical cyclones that have changed in the Philippines. You have more of these slow-moving, heavy rainfall type tropical storms, as well as the other end, which is the super typhoon type.
Right.
And where these, in fact, are crossing should be a matter of some concern, in fact, with development planning as well as climate change policy. So moving fast enough, it actually means building capacity, scientific and technical capacity. And in fact, we're well on the way there, I'd like to say.
So I'm going to ask you to break what building capacity means. Break it down a little bit more for us. Because every year since 2009, we've had typhoons do strange things.
Yes.
Right? Swing through a part of the country where it's never been, Haiyan in 2013. So what does building capacity mean? This you take home also.
Yes. So there's building capacity, in fact, in terms of weather. Operational weather needs. And in fact, that's what's happening now in the National Weather Agency. You do have an upgrade in equipment. You do have an upgrade in analytics tools. You do have an upgrade in the way it's communicated. And in fact, human resource upgrading is happening there as well. What we really need to do is then expand that to look at how this enhanced weather operational capacity really can impact climate analysis. And in fact, that's also happening slowly at the Weather Agency. Now, in terms of risk and resilience, this is just one part of the equation. You need to build capacity in terms of analyzing patterns of human development that in fact create, enhance, and continuously increase risk because of exposure and vulnerability. So these are components wherein we do need to get some integrated thinking together and some unified action in terms of the Philippines.
So again, collaboration.
Yes.
This is a question coming in from Twitter. We have about 11 minutes left, so throw in your last questions there. They're great. You can also hijack them in the coffee break afterwards. But this one is coming in from Twitter. Oh, it moved away. Come here, Twitter. There it is, from @Beyond2030. And there's an implicit assumption here I'd like you to also address. The question is, if we can spend every dollar only once, should we spend on making communities more resilient to climate change, and here's the assumption, or on trying to avoid climate change in the first place? Is it possible to avoid climate change?
This is almost going back to the old adaptation and mitigation debate. And the answer is that we can no longer afford to pose that question because we need both. And it's a question of priorities and affordability. So, for example, the Philippines now has 4 months to come up with a national commitment, and we've been working on this for 10 years. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean the Philippines gives up? No, it means that you can leapfrog what we've been doing. Instead of having a department of tree huggers, as we used to call them, we now have a forest of departments. Every single department of our government is committed to this. Here, the Climate Change Commission alone can't deliver the target. So every line ministry, every local government unit has to come up so that it all adds up to a target and something that can actually be implemented, both on the mitigation and on adaptation. I really think it's a false argument to actually have now.
Yes. Do you think that we are moving closer together to this collaborative idea? Are we moving, as we, society as a whole, doing it fast enough?
I see evidence of it every day. The fact that we are here today, where government, business, activists, and others are coming in, the people who are tuning in and are engaging in the debate, And in some respects, it began even when I remember when I was a child at school, when protection of the environment was big. We just looked at it from our locality, and because we like whales or some other sea creature. That whole infant debate has now become an adult debate, and it's now part of what institutions have to actually deliver. So I'm more optimistic because of that. We've evolved into a position that we're in for our sins as well as for our optimism and what we actually want to do.
Ladies, are you as optimistic as Ambassador Ahmad?
I would have to say that I am. In response to your question, I would spend the dollar or the peso on people who will change the climate. In fact, be able to change the condition that we're in. Those decisions are really within human hands and not just, the global forces. We are now, as most of you know, in the Anthropocene.
Yes.
People are beginning to realize that they're able to change the way the Earth behaves. And in fact, that solution is within our hands. So I would spend my money on people.
I love that. She's spending her money on you, Saya.
I 100% agree that I think it's a really unproductive distinction to make now between adaptation and mitigation. In a way, what I would hope for resilience is that as a term and a banner can move us sort of beyond that distinction, that these shouldn't be two separate side events. The next COP, it should be one conversation. It should be one type of strategy that we're building. And one of the things I think that makes me very optimistic about this, and it's implied heavily in the theme that we've chosen for this event today, is how much activity we're now seeing coming out of the local level to solve some of these challenges that we're facing. That actually, because we're getting hit, this is where we're getting hit. This is also where we're finding the motivation to actually develop some solutions, and it's in pockets right now. But this is where the real innovation and the spark is coming from. If some of these sparks can catch fire, I think that's the kind of energy and the momentum that has been so lacking in the climate debate until now.
So it's really it requires a new way of thinking that comes from the community itself. Cost seems to be an issue. There are several questions about how much does it cost to actually be resilient? What are cost-effective strategies to becoming resilient? Most of the interventions are cost-dependent. One, is it true that most interventions are cost-dependent? And then two, how would you, if you're a business, if you're a community, how would you do it so that it's affordable?
So totally dependent on context, I would
Context,
say.
right.
So in some cases, maybe your lowest cost option is investing in building higher walls, and that's just you pour a little bit more concrete. You don't have to kind of retrain anyone to think about that. Your engineers already know how to handle that kind of problem. In other cases, you make a little bit more investment in thinking a little bit differently about the problem, spend a lot less money on reinvesting in wetlands or something, and get much better bang for your buck or peso when it comes to then reducing your expected exposure.
Asif?
Well, the cost of doing nothing, I think, is the biggest challenge, because I think it basically means we stop eating, breathing, and moving. But if you look at things like, and I've got a distinguished architect sitting in the audience here, the cost of an architect's fee is neither here nor there. But a bad architect can create a legacy of poor building use. A good architect will give you the end product that you need. If you look at the way in which people farm, again, if you want to find out about climate change, ask a farmer. You don't need a scientist. They'll tell you things are changing, things are moving in a different way. I think in most activities, changing behavior is not actually a cost in itself. It's actually how you conduct yourself and what your belief systems are. But there are real costs. I'm not going to run away from this, and that's why we're underwritten this commitment of $7.7 billion, and it's not a cheap option to do what we're doing. But as I said in my presentation, these are also laced with business opportunities. You create jobs, you create new industries, you create new ways of connecting with people.
So just to follow up, you talked about it's in the people. Leadership, I suppose, is the right question now. I mean, is the leadership there? How do you spark it? How do you inspire people to actually act on this?
Yeah, leadership, I think nowadays, I was saying this to a few political commentators, the great giants of the past that we used to revere as great leaders, under modern scrutiny, I don't think they would survive. I don't think Winston Churchill in this modern day would be as revered as he was for what he actually did.
Because of social media? No, because it's just a difficult world.
And people are asking challenging questions.
Yeah.
So you can't just stand on a podium and make all these pious statements if you don't actually, in your behavior, in your policy, and in your delivery,
in your personal life even, right?
Exactly.
Leaders are under
a huge
extreme scrutiny.
So leadership nowadays comes with added baggage.
And Tony, please, on that last
Yes,
question.
perhaps leadership also in terms of context, in terms of scale, to combine both responses. I think that leadership is absolutely critical. And when you have a leadership that can broadly understand the implications of human action as well as the changes in the earth, that's the only time that you can have something that would really be able to be effective in terms of the challenges that climate change and other natural hazards bring to society today. To go back to something that Saya said and something the ambassador said, it doesn't cost much to be mindful of the environmental changes that is going on. You can measure rainfall with a tin can if you know how to do it.
That's good.
But the application of that information is what really takes some thinking through. And I want to bring my point back to education. We need to bring environmental education not just to basic education, but also to higher education and to lifelong learning. Communities need to continuously learn what's happening around them and how they can, in fact, change things and how the environment is, in fact, changing the way they can carve out a future in the society.
Fantastic. It's our last 3 minutes, like the basketball, last 2 minutes. So let's talk in the last 3 minutes about the future. Again, we've talked community and you've talked about individual, personal, companies, social, governments. Leadership right now in terms of capturing the youth. Well, the question is this, and I'll jump to what I would love you to also address. How can we help schools develop future engineers, technologists, having a mindset towards greener energy solutions? But I'll add a corollary to that in this very fragmented world where media is balkanized media, the youth are all over the place, and it seems like one of the forces that's actually captured them are many more evil forces like ISIS than the good guys, than governments, than communities. How do you do this and then actually push them towards even understanding greener energy solutions? I leave this to you. Saya, you first.
Okay. Well, that's a really important question, maybe the most important question. I think there are two things that educational institutions and also the other kinds of education and learning that we all experience in our lives can do better in this space. And the first is, of course, when we're training this next generation of engineers, to make sure that we're training engineers that have this interdisciplinary skill set, that we have scientists that know how to communicate, we have engineers that know how to read not just risk, but perceived risk, because those are things that they will definitely be confronted with, that the solutions that kind of emerge from their disciplines won't be the kinds of solutions that will kind of fly in this complex and interconnected world anymore. And the second thing I think is we have to understand better how to ourselves and our next generation of leaders tolerate ambiguity a little bit better, not just kind of expect the answers to be the answers all the time, but we had this experience in New York City a couple of weeks ago where the meteorologist got a weather call wrong.
The blizzard that wasn't a blizzard.
Yeah, the blizzard that was not a blizzard. And all New Yorkers were sitting quietly and obediently at home, and there was a lot of kind of, oh, the boy who cried wolf sort of responses. But I think that we need to build the resilience, if I overuse this word now, of our own understanding of what science is and what kind of certainty we need in order to be able to move forward out of sort of our sort of static positions. And I think that's the thing. If I try to kind of capture what kind of education change we need, that I would most advocate for.
Fantastic. Mr. Ambassador.
It's such a profound question, and in some ways, I'm using this as an extreme to prove a point, which is I think the way education's evolved. Traditionally, the UK and the West, we were very, very good at what I call facts, analysis, research, and we're the fountain of knowledge, as it were. But increasingly, we've become artistic, creative, and we're at the other end where we don't need to bother with the fact base. Asia is in a different place. We're terrifically good at maths, and if the teacher says something, the student the next day can repeat it without flaw. What we in government, business, and others actually desperately need are people who can take knowledge but then apply it. And that's what I call true education. And I think if you apply that to the issue that we're dealing with, the tin can example, the facts are there. What are you going to do with it? Yeah. Do you kick the can down the road, or do you actually do something with that knowledge and that information? And I think that is the real challenge. We in the West need to come back to some of our factual grounding. Asia needs to move into sort of saying, let's just move away from learning by rote. Yeah. And being questioning, analytical, and opinionated.
And Tony, to close.
So three things. Education is not the same thing as learning. You must move from lab to life. That's for the scientists in the audience. And for kids in the classroom, we need to step out of the classroom. It's about connectivity. It's about context. And aside from the formal learning that you have in the classroom, you need to go out and experience the way society really moves. And that's what will give you the arms for the future.
Fantastic. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists today for their insights. It is a scary world. You will hear now other inspirational stories of people who are also doing something about it. Please, during the coffee break, go and talk to each other and commit to doing something in your own social network now, in the next 24 hours. Let me bring it back to Maryam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. That was a great way to start the day.